Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone. Good morning, greetings. Let's jump right into it. So we are in session 3 of our course, What History Class Left Out Part 2, African History from 711 CE to 1896 CE. And we're going to continue our discussion in West Africa, particularly in the region around what's now modern day Niger and Mali. And then in the second part of class, we will do a brief introduction to the Empire of Kanem-Bornu, which we will spend a lot of time in April. In fact, April is going to be dedicated to this particular region of North Central Africa, the region around the Lake Chad area. This is one of the longest African empires in terms of its chronology in African history. So we're going to spend a lot of time doing an entire seminar on some of the personalities, events, and the historiography around Kanem-Bornu, because just like the Kingdom of Aksum and Ethiopia, just like Nubia, just like ancient Egypt, just like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, this is a territory who we have a tremendous amount of history on, and it's worth exploring. Again, so that we can practice Sankofa. We can see the beauty of this civilization, its achievements, and we should also see some of the setbacks in the civilization to see how we can move forward in a more sustainably developed way. But today, we're going to talk mostly about the Songhai Empire and its characteristics, the history around Songhai, some of the great personalities that existed. And we're going to, again, focus, like we did on Mali, around the question of how we remember and record history. We're in Black History Month. It's important for us to break down, methodologically speaking, how we know what we know and how sources differ from each other and how we can bring those different sources together to have a better, complete understanding of what actually happened. What's the evidence that we have for what actually went down in these empires? All right, so situating ourselves geographically. We started out the class talking about North Africa. We talked about the emergence of Islam in North Africa. We talked about the African and Arab domination of the Iberian Peninsula to the north, so Spain and Portugal. We talked about the Amazigh or the Berbers and their reaction to Arab domination in North Africa. That was week 1. Week 2, we talked about the Empire of Mali. We talked about its foundation with the epic of Sundiata Keita, and we talked about its most famous, worldwide famous ruler, Mansa Musa, and his pilgrimage to Mecca, his stopover in Cairo, and how that impressed the world. Mali, of course, was incredibly wealthy because it sat right at the nexus of a very important trade route, the trade of gold from the south and salt from the north. The empire made its fortune on the taxation of that trade, as well as, taxation generally throughout the empire. But one thing about Mali, Mali was an empire that was very loosely centralized. There was a Mansa, so the Mansa was the emperor of Mali. The Mansa was at the top, but as the empire was established under Sundiata, a lot of the local rulers were left in place. As long as they paid their taxes and paid the tribute necessary to the Mansas, who were located in Niani, primarily was the capital of Mali, then they were able to keep their position as long as they paid the tribute and they said that they were part of the empire. This relationship between the Mansas and the local rulers in other parts of the empire were maintained in a number of ways. Number one, marriage. Many of the Mansas or the other noble figures in Mali married women from the local areas and established alliances that way. The second way was through the holding captive of sons of the local rulers. And this was done throughout the ancient world. So as an empire arose, a kingdom arose and took over other territories, those local rulers would often ransom their sons as, privileged captives. So they weren't, put into forced labor or anything like that, but they lived in the capital regions very close to whoever the emperor was or the king was. In this case, we're talking about the Mansas of Mali. So the Mansa would have in his court the sons of local officials. That way, if the local official ever rebelled or seemed like they were going to rebel, then he could easily kill their sons. His sons right there. So it was an incentive for the local rulers not to rebel. It was also a way for the rulers of Mali to get to know who was next in line to be the local rulers in the local territories, and imbue them with a sense of Mandinka culture. And we see this happen even in antiquity. We saw this with Egypt. The Egyptians would often take the sons of the kings in Nubia, when Egypt had control of Nubia, bring them to Egypt. They would indoctrinate them with Egyptian culture, and then when it was time for them to go back to rule, when their fathers died or their mothers died, they would go back to rule in those local areas and keep that cultural tie going. One very interesting episode in terms of these relationships occurs in a few rulers after the great Mansa Musa. The Mansa at the time in Mali had two sons of one of the local rulers of the city of Gao, right there. You see Gao there, right near the bend of the River Niger here. That city of Gao was one of the small local kingdoms that had been incorporated into the Mali Empire. It was ruled by the Soninke people, very much descendants of the Ghana Empire, earlier that we've talked about, that Mali kind of supplanted. But there's nowhere near the glory that it once was when it was the Kingdom of Ghana. So these two Soninke brothers are living in the court of one of the Mansas in Mali. And they're treated pretty well, but they still have a desire to go back to their home. They don't want to remain as these privileged captives among the Emperor of Mansa. So the two brothers decide, and there's a whole oral history around these two brothers. One of the tales is that and this is recorded in the Tariq al-Fatash. And we'll talk about these texts in a second. These two brothers their father had married two sisters. So two sisters had married the same man. And the reason for that, the older sister was married to the man first, but she couldn't have any children. So she told her husband, well, why don't you marry my sister so that you can have children? Well, according to the chronicler, who was a Muslim, and this is against Islam to do this, sisters aren't supposed to marry the same husband, God played a trick on these two and got them both pregnant at the same time, and then both the sons were born on the same day. So they came up very close together. But anyway, as they grow into manhood, they eventually escape from the Mansa of Mali and go all the way from the capital of Mali back to their hometown of Gao. When they reach Gao, they're able to establish enough of a military presence to break away from the reach of the Mansa and essentially become an independent kingdom. This is the beginnings of the Empire of Songhai. It starts out as this kingdom that is broken away from the control of the Mansas in Mali. So, right, but it's still a small kingdom. It hasn't grown to an empire yet. It's going to take about 100 years before that happens. But this is the start. The descendants of these two brothers would go on to become the Sunni dynasty, or the Sunni dynasty, that would eventually establish the empire of Songhai. But this is an important story to tell because it shows the transition from one empire to another and what happened. And really what it tells us is Mali was made up of all types of little kingdoms like this. And some of them were able to eventually get strong enough to break away. And the most successful of these would become Songhai. But the story that I told and the rest of the narrative that we're going to recount today, what is our evidence for? Where does it come from? And how do we evaluate this evidence for this region? The written record. We're going to talk about a number of books today that are written by African scholars, some written by Arabic scholars. The Africans are writing in Arabic script. They're writing in the city of Timbuktu, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about today. It's one of the great learning centers of the ancient world. They're writing about this history. They're writing about this history. In fact, the Kingdom of Gao is actually written about even earlier than by al-Bakri, who we introduced last week, who talked about the Kingdom of Mali. He also talked about Gao, the city that would be the heart of the Songhai Empire. He talked about Gao in 1067. But largely, we're going to focus on the works of al-Sadi and al-Kati. Al-Sadi and al-Kati. This one is the later work, the Tariq al-Sudan. The Tariq al-Sudan, or the Chronicles or the Era of Sudan, which talks about the Empire of Songhai, it talks about the Empire of Mali, but is written after the fall of the Songhai Empire. It's written in the 17th century, end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century. Then we have the Tariq al-Fatash, which is the older text written by al-Kati, Mahmud al-Kati. Both of these writers are writing in Timbuktu, the great city of learning in West Africa. Al-Kati is writing earlier. Interesting thing about this book, although it is credited to Mahmud al-Kati, al-Kati only writes maybe 2/3 of the book. And then he dies. And then his sons and grandsons and nephews, they pick up the writing and editing of this book. And then, and me and Daniel were talking about this actually before we got on, there's some debate among scholars that this book was actually finished and completely edited a lot later, probably in the early 19th century, the late 18th century, during the time of the Fulani jihads that we'll talk about a little bit later on in the class in West Africa. But we do know that the first couple of chapters were written by al-Kati, who was a companion of one of the great rulers that we'll talk about today, Askia Muhammad. He had accompanied Askia Muhammad to Mecca. He was based in Timbuktu, and he writes this chronicle. The written record, Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatash, are written by Islamic African Muslims that are incredibly religious, incredibly pious, and their writing is tinged with a desire for true Islam and a desire to recount this history from that framework. It's not just a political history, it's not just a social history, it's also a spiritual history. And just like the authors of the Bible or other texts, they explain a lot of the things that happen throughout the kingdom's era as in religious terms. So when bad things happen, it's because the people disobeyed God. When good things happen, it's because the people had the favor of Allah, so on and so forth. And it makes sense that they would do that. These scholars are essentially religious scholars. Although they have an understanding of history, they have an understanding of law, diplomacy, and these types of things, their primary objective are to be clerical scholars. They're based in theology, and that, is what influences what they write. So the city of Timbuktu was not just a secular place of learning, it was primarily a religious place of learning. So everything came out of the root of Islamic studies and Islamic learning. So that's very important to point out, because as we recount this history, we not only rely on the Tariq al-Fatash and the Tariq al-Sudan, but also the oral history as well. Because throughout this region, of course, as we talked about last week, the oral history is just as prevalent, if not more prevalent, than the written word. And oftentimes, because the griots, or the jele, or in the plural, the jelu, these are the folks that are tasked by the upper classes, primarily the rulers, to record histories of families, to record histories of the nation orally, and to give these oral performances. And this was a guild, a vocation that stayed in particular families for generations. So you couldn't just say, wake up one day and say, I want to become a griot, I want to become a jelly. No, you had to be born into those families. And you were trained from very young with these histories. You were trained how to perform these histories. And Oftentimes, the Jelu, the oral historian, was often a musician because there were musical accompaniments when you're recounting these epics, the Epic of Sundiata or the Epic of Askia Muhammad, who we'll talk about. So the oral histories have a different tinge to them than the written record because many of the oral historians, particularly as we go further back in history, they're not Muslims or they're only Muslim in name. They're not Muslim. They're not as pious or as committed to Islam as the folks that write in Timbuktu. So we see a difference in approach in the oral history. They focus more on traditional African elements of the story. They bring in spiritual forces and things that the Islamic scholars aren't going to discuss. And it's with both of these sources together that we can get a clearer picture and understanding of not only what actually happened, because that's important, but more important is how the people use this history to explain their current condition and their future endeavors. That's important. History was never just, let's just write down exactly what happened and just leave it at that. It was used to explain the current situation and explain the motivations of rulers and why they did the things they did, what connects people, why certain groups are at odds with each other, why certain groups agree with each other or work with each other. So that's what all of these histories were about. And the influence of Islam on the written record and the non-influence of Islam on the oral record really shows the diversity in West Africa at this time, in terms of the ideological diversity, what people believe, what they practice, and how that played into who was ruling and how they remember, because that's very important. And even regional differences. Depending on where the author comes from, particularly in the oral history, you're going to get slightly different understandings of key individuals, like Sunni Ali Burr, who we'll talk about, or Askia Muhammad Ture. These are two different dynasties, two different families that ruled the Songhai Empire. And depending on who's telling the tale and where they come from, you're going to get different understandings. Sometimes villains become heroes, heroes become villains, depending on who's telling the tale. So historians have to bring all of that together, sift through all of that to figure out what actually happened and what we could take from this. And of course, there's archaeology being done in Songhai, still in its early stages. A lot more work needs to be done. But again, in Niger and Mali, there has been a lot of political instability, Wahhabist terrorism that has occurred in that region in recent years. So a lot of that has been on the back burner, but more archaeology needs to be done as well, and is happening. So speaking of the oral history, one of the tales that we rely on is the Epic of Askia Muhammad, which was told to Thomas Hale, who was a professor at Penn State University in the 1990s, by Nuho Malio. Nuho Malio was one of the most respected and highly trained griots in Niger. And I think he was located in the city of Gao, and he tells the Epic of Askia Muhammad Ture. The written version of his life is found in the Tariq al-Sudan, which by Sadi, and the Tariq al-Fatash by Kati. His oral epic of Askia Muhammad differs in a lot of ways. Askia Muhammad, well, I'll hold off on that to talk about the differences when we talk about Askia Muhammad. But this is a book that I think I put on the course website where you can read it, you can see how it is different from the writings in the Tariq al-Sudan. All of these books are widely available. You can get them, you should read them, because they're great primary source documents that talk about this history during this time. Of course, when we talk about secondary sources, things I recommend you read, UNESCO's Africa from the 12th to the 16th century, and of course, the Shillington book that I always mention. This book is a great just to have in your house to pick up if you want to learn about African history, History of Africa by Kevin Shillington. So let's talk about it. So after those brothers go back to Gao and they set up their kingdom and their dynasty, the Sunnis or the Sunnis, we'll say Sunni today just to be consistent. They eventually get strong enough through the creation of a very powerful navy and a very powerful cavalry that they're able to extend their influence from Gao throughout the region, starting in Kikuyu, then taking over Gao, then eventually taking over Timbuktu. And at this time, the Mali Empire is weakening. By the time we get to the 15th century, the Mali Empire is weakening, and the upstarts of Songhai are taking over, territory after territory. And all of this is happening along the River Niger. This river is just like the Nile River. Civilizations rise and fall based on the vitality of this river. Just like the Nile River, the River Niger floods every year. And when the river floods, you can plant crops along the riverbanks, and they grow bountifully. So the civilizations that emerge here, you can see where these towns are, with Gao, Kikuya, Timbuktu, Niani, all the way up the bend of the River Niger and down. So you have great agricultural production. You have great fishing opportunities for people that like to fish. You have great navies that emerge, particularly Songhai. Songhai builds an incredible navy of war canoes. I mean, these canoes will hold dozens of men, and they were able to conquer the river. And the towns that were alongside the river were forced to pay taxes and protection, because that's all empires are. Empires are just protection rackets. You better join the empire unless something bad happens to you. The same thing that the mafia does when they go into towns. You know, you want to make sure you pay us protection because you don't want something bad to happen to your store. That's essentially what empires are. So they're taking over the river, and then they also produce a cavalry, a very well-managed cavalry. So the rulers in Songhai, this emerging empire, are able to use both these weapons of war to take over territory after territory. And the most successful of these rulers is a man by the name of Sani Ali Burr. Sani Ali Burr, who reigned from 1464 to 1492. Now here's where our historical sources start to differ in how they explain who this man is. And now there's certain things that they all agree upon. They all agree that this man was a military genius. And these images come from the great Anheuser-Busch Black History calendars that were done in, I think, the 70s and 80s. And this wasn't done during his time. This was done in the 20th century. I just love these images. Something that they did for Black History Month. But anyway, Sani Ali Burr, he emerges from that dynasty based in Gao. He takes over Timbuktu. Timbuktu, since the time of the Mansas, had been a center of learning. The rulers of Mali had invested a lot in the maintenance of scholars in Timbuktu, the maintenance of mosques and learning centers in Timbuktu. So when he takes over Timbuktu, he has no respect for the scholars in Timbuktu. But the problem is, these are the folks that write history. So Sani Ali's actions in Timbuktu caused him to be remembered quite negatively in the written text. Now, when you go to the oral history, particularly around Kukia and Gao, the cities that Sani Ali's family emerged from, you get a different picture. You get the picture of someone that's a military genius, that established the empire, and that, you know, he was just a great warrior and a great empire builder. You don't get those same glowing accounts. But one thing that everybody agrees on, he was a hell of a fighter, and he never lost a battle. And he spent all of his time as the ruler and establisher of the Songhai Empire fighting battles, battle after battle after battle. When we had our seminar on Haiti, we talked about the figure of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Dessalines is very much like Sani Ali Burr. These were magnificent warriors, but they weren't necessarily the best administrators. This is very similar to Shaka of the Zulu. Magnificent warriors. They could fight, they could kill, they could conquer, but they weren't necessarily the best administrators. But we know that they could fight. So I like to compare Africans to Africans. Some people say, oh, this is the African Napoleon, or this is the African Wellington. No, we can compare Africans to Africans if you know the history. So Dessalines is very much like Sani Ali Burr, or Shaka of the Zulu. But I just want to read you some of the things that have been said about Sani Ali Burr. And this is the empire that he established. Again, with its capital in Gao, it was able to take over this entire region. And in fact, although Mali is seen as a separate empire, this became a part of the Songhai Empire. So this empire stretched from west in the Atlantic to east into modern-day Niger and all the way north to the salt mines, which become very important, of Tagaza. Tagaza is an area where salt is mined, and salt was an incredibly valuable resource to the people in the south. So the gold was coming north, the salt was coming south, and the Songhai Empire was taxing all of that trade. The city of Tagaza is going to play a very important role in the fall of the Songhai Empire, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, according to Tariq al-Sudan, and this is the English translation of the Tariq al-Sudan done by John Hunwick. I think he did this first in the 80s, but subsequent editions have been released. So get this book if you can. This is what is said about Sunni Ali. Chapter 12, The Reign of Sunni Ali. As for the great oppressor and notorious evildoer Sunni Ali, I'm going to skip that. He was a man of great strength and colossal energy, a tyrant, a miscreant, an aggressor, a despot, and a butcher who killed so many human beings that only God Most High could count them. He tyrannized the scholars and holy men, killing them, insulting them, and humiliating them. So this is what it says about Sunni Ali and the Tariq al-Sudan. So you see some things about him. He's a man of great strength and colossal energy, but he was a butcher, and he killed all these people. And most importantly, he tyrannized the scholars and holy men. When he attacked Timbuktu, he had no regard, no sense of respect for the scholars in Timbuktu, the way that the Mansas in Mali had. They're the ones that set them up. But again, these are the people that eventually write the history. So they couldn't have said any of this stuff about him while he was alive, of course, because if we found out he had him killed. He had him shaking in his boots when he entered Timbuktu and ran through the city. But after he dies, these are the things that are written about him by the scholars in Timbuktu. They talk about him not really being a Muslim. One of the written records say he was such a fake Muslim that he would often say, when he mentioned the Allah, he would say, peace be upon him, and he'd give all power to Muhammad, which is backwards if you know anything about Islam. When you mention the Prophet Muhammad, you say, peace be upon him, and then all power is Allah's. But he just had it so mixed up that he was just saying it just to sound Muslim that he had the whole thing mixed up. This is what they say about him. In Tariq al-Fatash, I want to read to you another description of him. So this is from the other book, the one written by Al-Kati, the earlier one. And this is coming from Intellectual Traditions of Pre-Colonial Africa by Constance Hillier. This is another book that I also recommend. It's a collection of actual primary sources, short primary sources from various kingdoms and areas in Africa, all over the continent, north, west, south, and central. So it's a good book to also have. But this is what it says about Sunni Ali here. The tyrannical, debauched, oppressive, and accursed Sunni or Chi Ali became the successor to Silman Dama and the last ruler of the dynasty whose administrators also initiated this man's contemptible conduct. Always victorious, Sunni Ali sacked each and every country upon which he fixed his sights. Always the victor, never the vanquished. He did not spare from attack any region, city, or village extending from the country of Kanta as far as Siberidugu. He marched at the head of his cavalry, warring against the populations and ravaging their territories. This is more of what he says about him. The tyrant Sunni Ali exhibited such cruelty that he once shoved a child into a mortar and then forced the mother to crush him alive with a pestle. The child's flesh was then thrown to the dogs to eat. This is who he said. Take a moment to observe his actions, the lengths to which this man would go in impiety. He condemned learned juriscouncils to death. Oh, how many villages he destroyed, incinerating their inhabitants as well. He inflicted all manner of torture on people. Sometimes he exterminated them by fire. Other times he was known to immure human beings in a wall as a means of disposing them. It was even said that he had opened the abdomen of a live woman so that he could rip the fetus from her body. In brief, these acts of cruelty and botchery grew so numerous that it is simply not possible to enumerate all of them. This is what happens when you attack the people that write history, because they're the ones that are going to write about you. Did he do all these things? Who knows? We know he never lost a battle. Everybody agrees upon that. But ripping babies out of pregnant women and burning people alive, we don't know. But we do know from all of this, his attacking of the scholars at Timbuktu have led to his reputation being destroyed. So that's an important thing to think about when we talk about history, how people will be remembered, because this is the written record. But in the oral traditions that come out of the region that he's from, he's remembered more fondly. What's focused upon is his victories, and his establishment of this empire. As was mentioned, he spent the entire time fighting. They didn't have a lot of time administering the empire. He did have a number of generals that worked with him, and one of his trusted generals was a man by the name of Muhammad Ture. Sometimes he has different last names, but we'll go with Muhammad Ture. And Muhammad Ture was his general, but Sunni Ali didn't trust him. And this is Muhammad Ture. We're going to talk about how he got the name Askia, or the title Askia. So Sunni Ali apparently dies in battle. Some say he drowned in the river, but he dies in battle. It probably was some type of inside job, but he dies in battle. His son takes over. Let's say he dies in October or November 1492. His son takes over. His son only reigns to 1493 before there's a military coup led by Muhammad Ture, who was a general in in Sunni's military. There is some oral tradition that Sunni Ali was so jealous of the power of Muhammad Ture that he actually had him imprisoned at one point in time. And it was through the efforts of Muhammad Ture's mother that he was able to be released from prison. But it's with Sunni Ali's son that Muhammad Ture makes his move and deposes the son. So the empire now falls into the hands of the Tures and Muhammad. So again, another episode from the Tariq al-Sudan, which talks about this changeover in dynasties. And notice how they talk about Muhammad Ture. Notice the words that are used. Thus, the most felicitous and well-guided one became ruler on that day. And that was Amir al-Mu'min and Khalifa of the Muslims. When the news reached the daughters of Sunni Ali, they said, "I see Kia," which means in their language, "he shall not be it." So let's go back. So the daughters of Sunni Ali hear that their brother has been killed and that Muhammad Ture is now in charge. And they say, "I see Kia," meaning it shouldn't be. He has stolen the rulership. He shouldn't be. This guy's so slick, or not even slick, but he takes that word and he says, "You know what? I'm going to use that as my royal title. Askia." So Askia is just like Mansa. It's a title. It means the emperor, the ruler. So Askia. So all of his sons and grandsons and the people that would rule after him were all called the Askias of Songhai, the rulers of Songhai. So that's the term that he used. Through him, so it goes on to continue. Through him, God Most High alleviated the Muslims' distress and erased their tribulation. He strove to establish the community of Islam and improve the people's lot. He befriended the scholars. You see that? He befriended the scholars, meaning just like the Mansas of Mali, he provided for the scholars. What they would do is they would actually subsidize knowledge. They believed in knowledge so much that they told scholars, "Listen, you don't have to work on the farms. You don't have to be a businessman. All you need to do is produce knowledge. Write books." Again, there's no printing press. So all these books are being handwritten. So you had to know calligraphy and all that. So all they said, "We want you to just sit in Timbuktu, write books on religion, write books on law, write books on politics, write the histories. Just write. Just teach and write. And we're going to subsidize that because we love knowledge so much." Sonny Ali didn't care nothing about. No, he just wanted plunder, and according to some sources, he just wanted plunder and just to fight in war all the time. He wasn't interested in that, so he didn't subsidize people. In fact, he ran up in their pockets and in their house in Timbuktu looking for treasure. But when Askia Muhammad comes, he eased their tribulation. He befriended the scholars and sought counsel from them over the appointments and dismissals he made. He made a distinction between the civilian population and the army, in contrast to what had prevailed in the tyrant Sonny Ali's reign, where everyone had been a soldier. So Sonny Ali said, any young man of a certain age, you're fighting, whatever it is you are. So people enjoyed Askia Muhammad. I mean, according to the scholars. He was a great administrator, unlike Sonny Ali. Askia Muhammad set up a very tight administration. So he did things different than the Mansas of Mali. Askia Muhammad said, I'm not leaving the local rulers in charge of the areas that I take over, like Mali did. I'm going to appoint my own leaders. Some of them may be from the region, but many of them will come from the outside. And then they'll marry into the local population, but they will always owe their position to the Askia, to the Emperor of Songhai. So it's not going to be local people choosing who rules. I choose who rule. And my successors will choose who rules these areas. With that, this empire was much more centralized than what we had in Mali. They had a system of taxation, a system of tribute. So all of this is making the empire incredibly wealthy. Just like Mansa Musa of Mali, Muhammad Ture makes Hajj. He becomes Al-Hajj Askia Muhammad Ture. He makes Hajj. He goes to Mecca. And just like Mansa Musa, he makes a spectacle out of it. So he brings a bunch of gold into Cairo and into Mecca. He brings back scholars from Mecca and Cairo. It's actually Mahmoud al-Kati, the man who wrote the first parts of the Tariq al-Fatash, that accompanies him to Mecca. So the writer of this book is a witness and a first-hand witness of Muhammad Ture. He becomes a principal diplomat as well as an administrator in the Songhai Empire, and he writes this book. So you can see why he would have such a negative view on Sonny Ali, and so many of these other written scholars had negative views on Sonny Ali. But even in the oral history about Askia Muhammad, we have some differences than what's written in these books. In these books, his father's just a regular Soninke man. His mother is a Soninke woman. They get together, they have him. He becomes a general. He, overthrows Sonny Ali's children and becomes, the ruler. In the oral tradition, it's much more elaborate. His father is actually a jinn. Those of you who aren't familiar with Arab or Islamic mythology, a jinn is like the root word of the word genie. It's this spiritual force that takes many different forms. But in this case, his father is a jinn that lives in the river Niger. And he comes out of the river in the form of a man, and he, has this relationship with his mother, and that is what gives him his specialness, is his father is a jinn. That's the oral tradition. And there's a lot of other things in the oral tradition that talks about his rise and how special he is and how he ruled. So, of course, we don't think his father is actually a jinn, but there are aspects of that oral history that fill in gaps about his life and his motivations that we don't see in the written text. So, again, we have to combine both of those. And the fact that his father is called a jinn and these other spiritual elements, it does go to show the importance of that oral narrative to the non-Muslim populations, because they probably wouldn't even have called them the jinn. There's probably an African equivalent to those spiritual forces that was probably the more appropriate word than jinn, but as it's translated from Soninke into English, jinn just becomes a word that's used. But really important when we look at these sources for Askia Muhammad Ture. Let's take a break for a second, and then we will come back to talk about Songhai. And then we'll talk more about the regular people in Songhai and what was going on. And then we'll talk about Songhai's fall. And we'll conclude with a kind of a preview of Kanem Bornu. Before I go into questions and comments from everyone, Daniel, is anything you want to add about what we talked about so far?
No, I don't have anything to add. There is a comment here that I think could add though. It said, someone said, I don't know if this has any connection, but the Kiswahili word for I hear or I understand is Nina Sakia. It sounds like Nina Askia or I have a ruler, almost like your wish is my command. Makes me wonder if that is the origin of the word. Kiswahili has a lot of Arabic words in it.
Possibly, but I think it's just a coincidental connection because that Askia, that's coming out of Soninke dialect, so it's not even Arabic, and so it's probably just a coincidental connection.
And Clyde, one more thing. If there's a comment in the chat. Someone said it's hard to see the map, and they wanted to know if the screen could be shared or if the camera could zoom in.
Okay, we might be able to zoom in. So they might be having a hard time seeing the maps or something. I'll go to the map just for folks to see it. It might not get a little better, but I'll keep that in mind next week, and I will be able to share the screen at certain points. But that's a good thing to know. All right, we'll go to the first hand. I'm not sure whose hand that is. Daniel, whose hand is? Oh, okay, Mr. Francis. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm particularly fascinated by the historical account of the behavior of Suli Ali. And I'm wondering, when I look at people like Kim Jong-un, Pinochet, Papadop Duvalier, Idi Amin, Eric Gehry, Grenada, Forbes, Burnham, and Diana, these are only one individual. How were they able to bring about such atrocities on people? When did I knew Gehry personally. He was a short man. And yet for he had a gang of people called the Mongoose Gang, who used to terrorize Grenada. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of explanation that you can give as to how these people can be so influential, but get so many people to go along with them, and the whole idea of being tyrannical and causes so much chaos and devastation for a country. How do you explain that when one individual can extend such influence over so large a people?
It's really amazing how these things happen, because I always think about these things too. Like, why doesn't somebody just kill them? But they're able to put around themselves so many people that are personally dependent upon them for their own survival and their own livelihood. So they're good at doing things like that. Oftentimes these people do have a modicum of charisma that have gotten them to that point that far. I mean, and they usually have some type of talent. Like, we know Sonny Ali Burr was a military genius. He was good at it. And he was able to command men and as a general and create military formations and do these things to take over cities. So he had followers that were willing to go with what he wanted to do, because he was, again, they would attack towns and then they would pillage, so everybody would get rich. Of course, he'd get a lot of it, and then his generals would get the rest. So you had his sons that were generals and people in his military and other folks. So they create buffers in between themselves and folks that might try to kill them. And of course, his sons are dependent upon him for their well-being. As we saw, as soon as he was gone, the son tried to take over, and the Ski Muhammad took him out. So they're good at instilling fear in people. They're good at instilling dependency on key people, and they're good at eliminating early the people that could possibly challenge them. They're very good at that. Dictators recognize talent. They recognize who they can use, and then they recognize, okay, this person is too strong to be used, so we either need to get rid of them, or if we can't co-opt them, we have to go ahead and get rid of them. So they're ruthless in that way of creating those situations where people are operating out of constant fear, or they're dependent on that person, so they don't want to see them lose power. And and it takes sometimes people strong enough. And then a lot of people, quite frankly, just go along with it because they don't like conflict. They would rather just stay silent and let things be as they are, and they're afraid. But every now and again, you get people that say, "I'm not going to take the money. I'm not afraid of this person, and I'm going to stand up and fight." But they're very few and far between. Most people just kind of go along with things. Once someone shows that they're that ruthless, a lot of people get scared. It's the same thing we're seeing right now in Russia. I mean, I'm not necessarily on the Western side of things in terms of the understanding of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, but it's very clear to see that Vladimir Putin is clearly hanging on to power as much as he can, and if you cross him, you'll end up like that guy that just got killed over there now. So folks that want to cling to power operate on fear and they operate on dependency, and they have to use both of these things to keep the population and the key people that could upset their rule in line, and watch out for the folks that aren't afraid of them, that don't want the money. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we have these things. But I always go back to, with Sonny Ali Burr, these are just the reflections of the scholarly class in Timbuktu who he, quote unquote, insulted and upset. The oral history is not exactly the same. So it's probably a mix of both. He probably was a ruthless ruler, probably had to be, he was constantly fighting. But did he do all of the depraved things that were mentioned? And again, a lot of these writers, they're coming from a particular Islamic theological perspective. So they're trying to paint him as debauched and demonic as possible, because they're trying to say, if you don't have a truly Muslim ruler like Al-Hajj Askia Muhammad Touré, who made Hajj and did all these things, if you don't have a truly Muslim ruler, this is what's going to happen to your society, and this is the type of leaders that will be created. So they probably exaggerated the amount of tyranny and debauchery associated with Sonny Ali Burr. So that's also an important thing to balance out when it comes to these narratives. It's an interesting way. And we're again, I won't spend a lot of time because we have a lot of questions, or we have a few questions, but we can look at contemporary figures and we will see this same back and forth between their supporters and the folks from the outside. Because as I mentioned, there are people that are trying to rewrite the history of Papa Doc, and to say that, no, he actually was pretty good and he didn't do all these things, or it wasn't as bad as was said. Then you got people that are trying to balance out the legacy of Muammar Gaddafi. The West said he's a butcher, he's on it. The West would equate Muammar Gaddafi with Sonny Ali. But then other folks, Pan-African and others, would say, well, yeah, he killed as many people as other rulers have killed and have imprisoned, but he also did these things for Africa and this as well. So you have to balance it. And the narrative is always, depends on who is writing or saying or discussing the history. So that's an important thing to point out. Robin, go ahead. So the question was, how did they enforce the taxes? And the second part was, why was salt so valuable? I'll answer the second part first, it's easier. Salt came from the north. Salt was really good for preserving food primarily. And as you go further south and you get toward the more tropical region, if you can preserve food, fish and other things like that, salted, it increases your food supply, you know, in addition to flavoring and all that. So it's very important for that regard. And it was worth basically its weight in gold, because there wasn't a lot of salt in that part of West Africa, the southern part of West Africa, as it was in the north. So it traded again for its weight in gold. The taxation, they were able to use an extensive road network, because one of the things that the Ghana Empire, Mali, and Songhai, all three of them did, they made it so that business could run through the empire smoothly. So there were guards all around the roads that made sure that there weren't people attacking caravans and traders and all that. So they had a network both on the roads as well as with the river, because they had a navy that were able to extract the tribute from the rulers. And then what Muhammad Ture was able to do, because he replaced local rulers with people that were specifically appointed by him or his successors, they were able to keep tabs on, hey, wait a minute, has so-and-so region paid their tribute? Oh, if not, I'm calling, I know who it is, I'm calling them in, I'm replacing them. So those appointed local rulers knew that they had to produce the amount of tribute, whatever the taxation was, whatever it is, because their job depended on that. Their life depended on that. So they made sure that in their areas, the taxes were collected. So it's a chain all the way up to the Askia. And they were very good at it. I mean, the administrative tools created by Askia Muhammad were very well done. And that's why they were able to be so rich, even though the empire only lasted for about 100 years. But we'll talk about why it fell in a second. Daniel, anything else? I see anything pop up in the chat or any other hands?
No, there's nothing else in the chat, and I don't see any hands.
All right, so let's move into it. So, again, Askia Muhammad Ture's reign is well remembered. He reigns for a long time, about almost 80 years, and he does a great job until the end. And it's not even really his fault. But toward the end of his life, he starts to go blind. He starts to go blind, and he's really reliant upon one of the officials in his palace. Like so many rulers, as Askia Muhammad Ture grew his empire, built upon what was done by Sunni Ali, he married a lot of wives, particularly wives of the regions women of the regions that he conquered, because when you do that, again, it establishes alliances, and any of those heirs could become possibly the next Askia. So when he goes blind, one of his sons decides, this is a good opportunity to overthrow my father, and he does. So he's deposed by, actually it's a collection of his sons, but then one son is put in his place. So he actually goes into exile, and he dies about 10 years later after he's deposed. But the scholars are all of the opinion that that was kind of jacked up that his sons did that. That wasn't something that was looked favorably upon. The succession of Askias that are chronicled in the Tariq al-Fatash and the Tariq al-Sudan, some of them were good Askias, some of them were not. Some of them, really invested into Timbuktu and invested in the administrators and the scholars. Some of them were debauched, and they're written about as being horrible Askias. But the problem with this empire, which lasts about 101 years, is that by the time we get to the end, so we can date the establishment of Songhai to around the 1490s, and it ends in 1592. By the time we get to 1592, the problem of succession has reared its ugly head again in an African empire. We saw this in Mali. This is possibly what happened in Ghana, and we're going to see this in other kingdoms, particularly when we get around the time of the slave trade and colonialism. This has been a continual problem in African politics from this time and even continuing into today. The problem of succession. Because rulers like Askia Muhammad had some of them had hundreds of children. So they're having wives and they're marrying women, and then they also have concubines on the side in addition to the wives. So they have, and all these children are legitimate. They're considered legitimate children. And because it has now moved from a matrilineal succession of many African kingdoms to a more Islamic-based patrilineal succession, where you had to be related to the ruler through your father, that has caused issue. So now you have dozens of contestants for the throne. And these folks have their own personal armies that they can put into play, and all these various alliances, and then even outside alliances, because there's other African kingdoms, such as Kandin Bornu, which we'll talk about. The Hausa states are rising. We have the Mossad kingdom in Central North Africa as well. So you got these different, and to the north you have the Amazigh, the Berbers, and even further north you have the Moroccans, who we'll talk about in a second. So you have all of these external forces. You got internal conflict because you have civil wars that emerge. After an Askia would die, who's going to rule? Well, the sons would fight it out to see who's going to be the next Askia, which causes damage, which causes taxes not to be collected, which causes insecurity on the roads, which leads to a drop in business and revenue. So all of this internal chaos as a result of the succession question really weakens the Songhai Empire by the time we get to the late 1500s. So let's not moving. So let's talk about the kingdom as it looked at this time. What was going on? You had at the top of this social hierarchy these nobles, people related to the royal family or people appointed by the royal family to oversee local areas. You had the nobles. In between the nobles and the captives, because you had a captive class of people, if folks rebelled against the empire or as the empire was expanding and wars were being fought, people would be captured. These captives would be made enslaved often. Their slavery was not like the slavery that's at this time emerging in the Americas, because this empire has its height between the 1490s and the 1590s. It's the same time that slavery is occurring in the Americas. It's not the same type of slavery. Enslavement in the Songhai Empire is a result of being captured in war. You're a war captive, and you can come out of that condition. You can work your way out of it. You're still considered a human being. That's the number one difference. In the Americas, Africans weren't considered human beings. They were considered property and chattel. In this situation, you were considered a captive, a prisoner, and then you were enslaved, and you can work your way out of that. Although the stigma of you being captured would remain on your family. So there were certain things you couldn't do. You couldn't marry certain people, and there was always kind of a taboo about that. Even to this day, in certain territories, depending on your last name, depending on if people know your family's history, if you were once a captive or, once in a dependent relationship with another family or another clan, there's marriage taboos and some other things. But you're still considered a human being. It's just my children can't marry you, or it's frowned upon. One of my professors actually at Lincoln University told me back in the day when African students would go to Europe or America to study, he said one man from his community had met a woman and they fell in love in, I think, either England or France. But then when he told his family who she was and her last name, they're like, nah, you can't marry her. I mean, that's cool to do out there in the diaspora, but back here, we know her family. We know that they were once either a captive or some other taboo, whether they were a family of blacksmiths or a family. So there's all these kind of, you can't really marry that person. It was an interesting thing. But again, nothing nearly comparable to what was going on in the Americas. All right, so you had the nobles, you had the captives at the bottom. In between, you had the free men. The free men. These are everybody else in the empire. These are folks that, farmed. They were fishermen or fisherwomen, market women, long-distance traders. They engaged in the trade that we talked about, going to the north, going east to west, because there was also trade routes going that way from the Atlantic Ocean into the Lake Chad area. So you had people engaging in all types of enterprise in the Empire of Songhai. Then you had, again, those vocations that some scholars tried to present them as if they were caste, like in the same type of makeup as what you see in India, but that's not really a one-to-one understanding. It's really more so people were born into these vocations and trained to be in these vocations, and that was a reality for them, that's what they did, that's what their families did. So blacksmiths, weavers, people that did, clothing. Of course, the griots, the oral historians, that was their own guild and their own, social entity. So you had these groups as well, also in the kingdom. It's from that group, it's kind of an in-between between nobles and that group that you find the scholars in places like Timbuktu. These scholars would write tremendous volumes, like the Tariq al-Sudan, the Tariq al-Fattaj. You had scholars like the famous Kati family that lived in Timbuktu, that was able to, actually not Kati, the Akit family, who dominated religious and secular thought in Timbuktu for many decades. They wrote hundreds of books. One of the most famous members was Ahmed Baba. This is not the, there we go. Okay, so again, this is the formula that I wanted to show. Nobles, freemen, captives, and the artisans. So one of the great proverbs at the time, to show you how important scholarship was during this time period in this part of Africa, we had this proverb: salt comes from the north, gold from the south, and silver from the country of the white men, but the word of God and the treasures of wisdom are only to be found in Timbuktu. Scholars have estimated that the amount of books and scholars and learners in Timbuktu incredibly outpaced Oxford and any universities in Europe at this time. Learning was taking place in Africa. We're talking about the 1400s. This is what was happening. One of the key scholars was a man by the name of Ahmed Baba. Ahmed Baba, toward the later end of the Songhai Empire, who lived in Timbuktu. He saw the fall of Timbuktu and the fall of the Songhai Empire through the invasion of the Moroccans, but he was a tremendous scholar. He wrote on a number of things. He wrote about more than 40 works. He wrote on slavery and its impact in West Africa and the Western Sudan. He wrote about his library, that he had the smallest library of any of his family. And the Moroccans seized 1,600 volumes just from him alone. And he had the smallest library, and he had 1,600 volumes. And again, you have to remember, this is before the printing press is in Africa. So all of these books are handwritten volumes. And he had 1,600 books. And he had the smallest library of anyone in his family. So you can imagine the amount of learning that's going on in Timbuktu and how valuable these books were, and how valuable the rulers of Songhai felt that education was and scholarship was, that they subsidized. They used the tax money that we talked about, the tax revenue, to subsidize this learning that was going on in Africa. So Ahmed Baba, his treatise on slavery was really important. He was saying that what we're seeing an epidemic of Muslims being enslaved by other Muslims simply because they're black. Because at this time now you're seeing more folks coming from North Africa and even from Europe that are engaged in this trade of enslaved Africans that are going both north into Europe, east through Egypt into the Arab world, and then it's to some extent in this empire west to the Atlantic, on the western edges of the Songhai Empire. So he's saying, wait a minute, Muslims, the Quran forbids the enslavement of Muslims by other Muslims. So we have to make sure that that's upheld. So he wasn't against slavery in general. He was just saying, don't let race be the overdeterminant of who can be enslaved. It's supposed to be based on your spirituality, your religion. So he writes this great article on slavery and other works, biographical works of different jurists and different thinkers. So Ahmed Baba is a great thinker. At this time, by the time we get to the 1500s, the Songhai Empire is dealing with these internal civil wars. Business isn't functioning, revenue isn't being collected as much, and there is now a problem that emerges between Songhai and a kingdom that's not shown here, but the Kingdom of Morocco, which is up here in northwest Africa. These are just the principal cities. I just want to kind of show you what's going on. So in the waning days of the Songhai Empire, one of the Askias sends one of his prisoners to, he was one of his officials that ran afoul of the Askia, so the Askia sentenced him to be imprisoned in Tagaza, up here at the northern extreme of the empire of Songhai. It's Tagaza where the salt trade emerges from, the salt that's going down south into the rest of Africa, and the gold is going up north into Europe, into other parts east. So Tagaza is incredibly important strategically to the empire of Songhai. In fact, if you look at a map of Songhai, you'll see this curve to the north. That's just Tagaza. All that's representing is it goes up to Tagaza and then the rest is back down. So they weren't interested in anything else other than this city of Tagaza there. That's what that little loop is. But anyway, this prisoner is sentenced to be imprisoned in Tagaza. He breaks free. He breaks free from prison and makes his way to Morocco. He gets to Morocco and he tells the rulers in Morocco, he said, look, things in Songhai are bad. They're horrible. The current Askia is immoral. They're practicing all types of idolatry again, and it's bad. So you should take over. You should come. You're a pious Muslim. You should come and take over Songhai. The ruler of Songhai at the time is a man named Ahmed al-Mansur. And Mansur says, this might be something worth considering. And he uses Tagaza as his pretext. He sends the Askia in Songhai a letter, basically saying, look, Tagaza traditionally has been a part of our kingdom and we want it back. We want you to renounce your control over Tagaza. The Askia in Songhai replies back to this response with 2 javelins and iron chains. And then he writes this message saying, I will never give up Tagaza to you, and if you try to take it, that means we go to war and we fight. So he basically, replied in that way. The thinking of the Askia at the time was the thinking of so many Askias, going all the way back to Muhammad Ture and even back to Sunni Ali. They never believed that threats to Songhai would come from the north. They fought against the Mosi people. They fought against the Hausas. They fought against other folks that tried to break away from the empire, the remnants of Mali Empire. These were their primary concerns, particularly the Mosi in the south and the Hausa in the southeast. This was their concern, and the Fulani. This was their concern. They thought the Sahara Desert was a natural barrier and no one would be foolish enough to bring an army over the Sahara to try to attack Songhai. So they thought that they were sitting pretty. So much so that unlike Kandahar Bornu, which is further to the east, they didn't even import firearms from the Europeans or the Turks. They thought, cool, we got our war canoes, we got our cavalry that's unmatched, and we have archers, and we have javelin throwers, and we got all these things. Why do we need guns? And you have to remember, this is the 1500s. So guns at this time weren't even really that, from what their understanding of guns, they weren't even that effective. These are those guns where you load them from the top, you push the powder and the bullet in, and then you fire it, and then you got to do that all over again, and then fire it. So it wasn't even really that effective if you had good archers, because an archer can just do this all day, and the projectiles are just as effective. Guns weren't as accurate as they are now, so it wasn't like it was that much of a military advantage that they felt that they needed to import guns. But the Moroccans had guns. The Moroccans had a way to get over the desert. They knew how to travel in the desert. They didn't bring a big force. They brought a small force with a number of more modern firearms, and they were ready to invade Songhai. So Al-Mansur doesn't go himself. He sends a Christian mercenary, a lot of white mercenaries that they get from Spain, actually, to actually fight this battle against Songhai. So they have white mercenaries, they have Amazigh mercenaries, and they make their way down into Songhai. And they attack Timbuktu, and they're incredibly successful at breaking Timbuktu. In fact, I want to read you just some of the reactions to this invasion. It would be it's another great book you can read. It's called The Documents from the African Past by Robert O. Collins. This is very much like the other book, which is a number of documents, primary sources that talk about this history. But this is what it was saying about, this is from the Tariq al-Sudan, about the depravity that was going on in Songhai, which led to this invasion. It was told that this moral corruption, so the situation remained thus until the moment when the dynasty of Songhai drew to its end and its empire ceased to exist. At that moment, faith was transformed into unbelief. All the things forbidden by God were overtly being practiced. The people drank wine and indulged in sodomy. Adultery became so frequent that its practice seemed to have become legal. Without adultery, there was no elegance, no glory. This popular feeling existed to such an extent that the children of sultans committed adultery with their sisters. It is told that this moral corruption first took place at the end of the reign of the Sultan, the Just, the Prince of the Believers, Askia Muhammad, that his son Yusuf invented this type of debauchery. When his father learned of these practices, he became violently angry and cursed his son, asking God to deprive Yusuf of his virile member before he entered the other world. God answered that wish, and disease made the young prince lose his organ of virility. The malediction spread to the son of Yusuf, and he too lost his virile member toward the end of his life after an attack of the same disease. So the writer is writing all of this to show how far down the empire has fallen in terms of its morality. Because again, these writers are all writing from an Islamic perspective. They're trying to explain what caused this empire to fall. And it must be because the people lost favor with God. So the Sultan sends these mercenaries. They come, they destroy Timbuktu. The Askia's army is basically routed because of the new guns that are brought by the Moroccans. But it's not just the guns, because they probably would have been able to hold themselves up in the face of these weapons. The problem was the people didn't have the will to fight. Because of all the civil wars, because of the tyranny that now existed among the rulers, and this particular Askia who is, I think his name was Ishak or Isaac, he was horrible. He didn't take advice from his counselors, including al-Sadi, the writer of the Tariq al-Sudan, who was one of his counselors, who was telling him, you need to get firearms and we need to evacuate Timbuktu because the Moroccans are coming. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. We'll beat them. They're not even going to make it over the Sahara. So he didn't take the counsel and paid the price. And his troops ran and fled because they didn't want to fight for him. And this is what led to that empire's demise. So it's a combination of the two things. Yes, the Moroccans had a slight technical advantage with their new firearms, but the more important reason for the empire's collapse was those succession battles that we talked about, the civil wars that occurred, the lack of security that everyday people felt, and the debauchery of the ruling class. Maybe not to the extent written by the writers of Tariq al-Fatash and Tariq al-Sudan, but really the corruption that started to make its way into the kingdom at the top levels. This is what led to the demise of Songhai. This is what leads to the demise of many African nations right at the time of slavery, as well as going into colonization. Succession battles and greed at the top of the leadership class. We can put this all the way into 2024, if you really think about it. When you look at what's going on the African continent, we look at some of the countries, we have succession battles. We have people that don't want to give up being president. And then once elections happen, when those people either die, which is a coup by God, people call it when these folks die, then you have all of these political parties emerge. And it's often violent elections that occur. And then you also have the external factor as well, because you have the West that plays a role in all of this as well. But internally, we have a problem with succession that we have not seemed to be able to solve in Africa. We couldn't do it with monarchies. We couldn't solve the succession problem. Democracy has proven, at least Western democracy has proven unable to solve it as well. We haven't completely figured that out in any way that's meaningful to the masses of our people. So we have to take these lessons. We have to understand that it's not external aggression that often topples strong empires. It's internal corruption and a misleadership class that topples empires, that topples civilizations, that topples nations. So very important to point that out. So after this, the Moroccan invasion, the empire pretty much disintegrates and smaller kingdoms emerge in its wake. And we'll talk about some of those smaller kingdoms a little bit later. But while all this is going on, to the east, we have the empire of Kanem-Bornu that is operating. I want to just introduce this kingdom because it's right here. It was, again, the eastern neighbor of the Songhai Empire, located around Lake Chad. An empire that lasted 1,000 years, right in the middle of these great trade routes that went west from the Atlantic Ocean, east to the Red Sea, and from south West Africa all the way north into Europe. So it's right at this nexus point between east-west and north-south trade. It becomes incredibly wealthy. It has an incredible political legacy. We have oral history, we have written history that comes from this, and all of this we're going to explore in April. We're going to talk about this kingdom because in this class, even with Songhai, we're just doing brief overviews of this history. This is not detailed, in-depth studies of these empires and these civilizations. It's not in-depth. It's just an introduction. I encourage all of you to read the books that I mentioned and the resources that I've alluded to so you can get a more detailed understanding of these things. Because it's not proper for you to think that African history can just be taught in 8 weeks and we know everything. These are nations and civilizations that you can spend a career just learning them. So we're going to treat African history the way it deserves to be treated. When you study European history, you can study just the history of France or just the history of Italy for years. It's the same thing with Africa, in fact, even longer. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Kanem-Bornu in April. Daniel is actually going to be leading that class, leading that discussion, because he's turning himself into somewhat of an expert on this region. He's learning it, going through all the primary sources. As a matter of fact, I'm going to stop now before we go open up to questions. And Daniel, what did you want to say about Kanem-Bornu or what folks can expect in the course in April?
That's a good question.
I put him on the spot.
I think what I would say to expect is to expect a lot about literature. Kanem-Bornu was one of the first places in West Africa to have a literary tradition, so can expect to hear about that. I would also say international relations. We're going to be talking a lot about African countries relating to other African countries and African countries relating to the outside world. So I would probably say those are some of the biggest things to look for.
All right. So again, April, that's what we're going to be discussing. And I would bet, I might lose this bet, but I don't think that I would. I don't think there's anywhere in North America that you're going to get a seminar that's going to last 4 weeks talking about Kanem-Bornu. I seriously doubt that. I used to do this when we had our classes in person back in the day. I didn't do it this semester, but I used to look up, at least in Ottawa, what's being taught on Africa at Carleton and at Ottawa U. And usually it's a general class. It's say African history, and it's just one class for the entire semester. Or if you get lucky, it might be African history since 1885, and it just covers everything in one 15-week period. But yet, when you look at their offerings in other histories, you'll get a class called The History of the Slovaks, taught at Carleton or Ottawa U. Slovak people are people that live in Eastern and Central Europe, and there's a whole class just dedicated to them. Or you'll get a class, French history from 1700 to 1802 or something like that. An entire 15-week course on just a 200-year period of French history or German history or British history. But yet all of Africa, all of this thousands of years and Hundreds of different nations and civilizations, people can be compressed into one 15-week course. Now, we do these general histories that we're doing for our 8 weeks because we're just trying to give you a nice overview. But that's not what universities are supposed to do. Universities are supposed to give you the detailed information. That's what they're doing for Europe. They're clear with what they do with Europe. But Africa doesn't get the same treatment. So we're trying to rectify that. And this is going to be the first of a number. We did it with Haiti to some extent when we did our Haitian seminar. Now we're going to do it on the continent, right smack in the middle with Camden Bornu, which is, again, gets limited attention, even though there's so many sources that we can reconstruct the history. But it gets limited attention because it's overshadowed by Ghana, Songhai, Mali, or the Nile Valley civilizations, and even to some extent, Southern Africa with the Zulu and other nations down there. So that's what we're going to do in April. So please join us for that seminar. Next week, we're going to talk about, what are we talking about next week? Next week, we're going to be talking about, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with Camden Bornu because we're going to discuss that in April. So we're going to talk more about, next week, we will spend a lot of time talking about queen mothers throughout Africa. So we're going to make our way from west, central, and east. So we're not going to talk about a particular place the entire session next week. We're going to talk about multiple places in this particular institution of the queen mother and how we see it manifest itself throughout the African continent. So that's what we're going to get into next week. So I'm going to stop there today, open it up for any questions or comments or announcements.